moderate this 16th flagship webinar or seminar of CSEP ever since we started. And today's webinar is shaped around Anup Singh's new book, which looks like this. That is Asia and the Changing Global Economy, Rebuilding Growth Potential. We are really fortunate and delighted, of course, to have four distinguished commentators on the book. I'll introduce them a little more detailed before each's appearance. Professor Anne Krieger, Mr. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, Naushad Forbes, and then Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. So we'll start with Anup Singh giving a broad overview of the book. The book consists of many of his articles that he's written over the last 4 or 5 years. And so it's very, very wide-ranging on the global economy, on specific countries that he's worked on, and also looking ahead. So as I understand it, he will speak on the outlook and risks in the global context, post-COVID, but pre-Ukraine war. And then open up discussion on how these risks have now been magnified by the war and their implications. I will then request Anne Krieger to speak after him. And as I said, then Martin Wolf, then Naushad Forbes, and then Montek Singh Ahluwalia. So let me also now introduce Anup Singh. He is his biggest achievement is to have been appointed a distinguished fellow of the Center for Social Economic Progress. And he's also been a member of the 15th Finance Commission of India. He was previously at the International Monetary Fund, and his appointments included being director of the Asia Pacific Department, director of the Western Hemisphere Department, and director of Special Operations. Although Anup, the Special Operations sounds very like the Russian operations in Ukraine. So I don't know what you were doing as director of Special Operations. His additional work experience also includes having been special advisor to the Government Reserve Bank of India, and he's also taught at Georgetown University. So Anup, with that introduction, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I feel slightly overwhelmed speaking before our speakers whom we have, but let me start. My idea was to start by looking at the global context before the war in Europe, in what was a short while ago an emerging post-COVID world recovery. Now, before doing that, I think it's important to look back and recognize that despite many setbacks and financial crises, the global economy has had a spectacular run since the Second World War. It was anchored by the post-war global economic system, its central financial and trade institutions, and the international rule-based system. This is important, I think, to remember. Now, we know that these came under pressure in the last decade. So all this makes it even more important to carefully consider today the lessons learned from previous crises, the contagion and spillovers, which will be repeated now in some ways, and most importantly, the role of the multilateral institutions and the international community in today's uncertain circumstances. Now, the point I want to make is, I think, 3 points. The first is, in what was an emerging post-COVID world, the advanced countries led by the United States were leading that recovery. Very much unlike what we saw after the 2008 global financial crisis, when it was China and India and other emerging markets that powered that recovery. Now, we know that this pre-war, post-COVID recovery taking place, however, was very uneven. Many risks had become apparent. and policymakers in the advanced countries too were slow to react. That is now well recognized. It's worth bearing in mind, however, that the US recovery was actually quite impressive. It was quite remarkable given the thoughts a year before that, given the size of the shock. And we had last year's US growth being well above its what we consider to be its potential. However, it has carried great risks, not just for the US current account, but also for financial market excesses, and as we all know now very well, for inflation. And looking back at the last few years during the recovery, really not much, if anything, had been done to roll back the Trump excesses, at least in trade. Now, all these risks that accompanied the US and global recovery obviously had implications across the world, especially for emerging markets, especially when advanced countries would begin to scale back their monetary support as they have now begun to do. It's important to remember one more point, which is very important and always reminds me of this, is that among the unevenness that we've seen in the global recovery so far is global trade. Now, on the one hand, you can argue, but global trade has recovered to its pre-pandemic level, at least in January, pre-war, driven by a shift of consumption away from services towards goods. But this recovery was very uneven, both between advanced countries and developing countries, and certainly among developing countries, including very much where we are in South Asia. And the pre-pandemic level of global trade should not be viewed as an achievement that we attained, but that was still well below the level before the global financial crisis. Therefore, even pre-war, trade was uneven, services lagged the recovery, and protectionist sentiments across the world was already driving the retreat of world trade and from global value chains, putting pressure on prices and other growth determinants. Now, finally, what about emerging markets? After the global financial crisis, emerging markets in Asia were leading the recovery. My sense is that over the past decade, well before COVID hit, the growth prospects of the emerging markets and developing countries, and especially China and India, their growth prospects were successively revised downwards. Their fragilities became more apparent. Yes, China did become for a while the largest country in PPP terms. India took over briefly the status of being the fastest growing major country. Both countries now have clearly become the subject of growth uncertainties in emerging markets. My sense is over the past decade, emerging markets and developing countries generally have not been converging. Instead, they've fallen further behind the advanced country. This is all pre-COVID. And my sense is their repeated downward revisions to growth have reflected their own declining growth and productivity fundamentals and the capacity to grow sustainably rather than being debt reliant and credit reliant. Okay, so now we have the war in Europe. And clearly it compounds and escalates these risks in a way that we don't yet know. But Martin, I think you have written more about this and you thought more about this publicly than almost anybody else has. So the question now is perhaps, let me raise three questions or more for our speakers. Firstly, the US has led the global recovery so far. So it's important that that be sustained. It's important that US growth remain, if it can, above its productive potential. So what can the US do in that regard? Not just domestically, but globally for the world. Recognizing that Europe will now be very much more affected. The US produced its own budget a few days ago. It is a question mark if that will be help in this regard. The second question is, which I'm sure Anne will speak on, is how now do we build multilateral support to so many things? But I would say let's first start with trade. Trade has been an anchor of globalization and global growth since the Second World War. How do we limit and reverse the protectionist responses that we are seeing now before the war in many countries, including India and perhaps China? And how can the international institutions manage the shocks that we're facing, food prices, energy, food security, and so on? In many ways, we are facing shocks that really we have not faced for a long time. It is clear, given that inflation is now a factor, advanced countries are scaling back, probably rapidly, some might say too rapidly. This will create emerging market crises across the globe. We are seeing some of this already clearly in South Asia. What can the IMF do to manage this? I expect this to be a major issue in the coming 6 to 9 months. And also it's important for us to see what can China and India do to build on their productivity fundamentals and not go back to having growth reliant on credit and debt. Now on China, a final point. This is the year of China's 20th Party Congress. It's an important year. China has recently announced a growth target for this year of 5.5%, which is much higher than the fourth quarter of last year. It's probably above what most analysts consider. Does this mean that China is now preparing to re-inject the fiscal and monetary stimuli that it had tried to move away from in recent years? That may be good in the short run for China. It may be good in the short run for the global economy, but it's not taking us to a world driven by fundamentals. Rakesh, I'll stop at that point and look forward to hearing our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anup. Let me just say for the benefit of the audience that Anup, as director of the Western Hemisphere Department, led IMF's program in Argentina. He was also among the leaders of the IMF's programs in Asia. And if you get his book, you'll see a lot of personal recollections of these programs and how the reasons behind the kind of structure these programs had, how they did or didn't succeed. So it's a really very, very rich treasure trove of personal experience from the IMF that Anup has had at least over the 35 years or so before he retired from the IMF some years ago. So that's just because he didn't speak as much about those issues that are covered in his book. So I thought I should inform the audience one of the reasons why you should buy the book, although we're not really his publicity agents. Let me now introduce Professor Anne Krieger. First, let me express a great appreciation for her gesture in appearing with us this morning for her, this evening for us, because she did unfortunately have a fall yesterday, the results of which you can sort of see a little bit. but not as bad as I thought that she had said it was. But really, we're very, very grateful, Anne, for you being such a sport that despite that, you got up early in the morning and got ready for this webinar. So let me now introduce her. She's a senior research professor of international economics, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She was a founding director for the Center for International Development and professor emeritus at Stanford University. She is, of course, known widely in the fields of economics and trade. She also served as president of the American Economic Association. I first got to know her when she was not closely because I was too junior at the time, when she was the World Bank's chief economist. And she was also the IMF's first deputy managing director earlier in the decade, earlier in the century, I should say, actually. We have had a long association, and the first CSEP's flagship seminar was actually releasing her book on trade, world trade. So Anne, here you go.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Rakesh, and thank you, Anoop, for writing such a good book. I do recommend it. It does cover, as Rakesh said, a number of topics, much more than we can do today, and I will focus on only.
And if there's any way you can speak louder, otherwise I think the audience won't be able to hear you.
Oh, has it gone down again? Okay, I'll try.
Yeah, that's better. Yes.
Okay. So at any event, I'll try and focus mostly on the trade issues, although a couple of other comments, and start with three things that Anoop pointed out that he thinks are important to understand. And first he said to me, please figure out why the share of trade in GDP has been going down. And actually, as I thought about that, I decided he'd actually given me some homework, which I did not expect. But I did a little bit of thinking about that and a little bit of research, and I'll answer that one first. And then the second question is, why has President Biden not reversed President Trump's trade policies? And that one I'll get to in a minute. And then finally, what can be done both in the US and otherwise to get the global economic and trading system up and going again. All of that condensed within too short a period of time, so forgive me if I hurry. But the interesting one really is what's happening to the share of trade, I think, because Anoop was convinced it was going down, and I'm not quite sure exactly what's happening, but let me give you some thoughts on this subject. The first thought actually has to do with what happened to the US. In 1970, the US share of world trade was, the US share of exports plus imports in its own GDP was 10.7%. By 2020, it was 23%. The United States increased its share of trade and obviously therefore grew it above trade. American trade grew above the rate of growth generally during that period, and so did China. If you standardize for their rates of growth, you'd already have world trade not going down. It's the fact that those growth rates in those two countries went down because both of them were so rapidly expanding. It has something to do with what happened, not all of it, but it is, I think, an important fact to remember. The second thing, which is in a way more interesting and is very misleading, is that measures of trade are measures of sales value. Gross national product is a measure of income. Now, when a company buys 70 cents or rupees worth of a good and some value to it and sells it for 100 rupees, its contribution or its revenue, net revenue, is 30% or 30 rupees, right? But we count it as 100 rupees of exports if it exports the good. So you get a number of countries where exports are greater than GDP as a percent of GDP. I'll give you some examples. Singapore's exports are 321% of GDP. Why? Because they import a lot of crude oil, among other things, and a lot of parts and components, and then they refine the crude oil and they also assemble the parts and components. So that what they're exporting has all the value of what they imported plus what they added to it. Hong Kong's 352%. You can say, okay, that's only China. But Luxembourg's is 376%. And obviously it's a small country, so there are companies that import many things, they add value to it and they export. What we've done over time is we've increased the number of rotations of that. There are reports that parts of an automobile, complex parts of an automobile produced in the United States can cross the Mexican border as many as 11 times. Each time that's going to be counted as part of exports and imports. So the exports to GDP reflect a number of things. It's not very serious in the US case because our value added is about 90% of the total value of exports. So it's not a big deal. But worldwide, I think that the share of GDP in exports has gone down, in part because the share of value added has gone down because so much is going around repeatedly, and that's part of what's showing up. The third thing is, of course, services, because services were historically traded less because it cost more and they were mostly local. That's changing. No doubt that it's changing in a way that's good, and it's also increasing as a share of world trade. But although services are growing more rapidly than trade as a whole, they are still less than trade, and their share is increasing of GDP more rapidly than it is, or has been increasing more rapidly than it has in exports. So all of those factors have contributed to this apparent change in what's happened to the GDP ratio. Now let me for a second look at what's happened in the world. Actually, in 2008, trade as a percent of GDP, now remember this is gross versus net, which is a strange concept, but that's what we always use, was 60.8%, i.e. almost 2/3 of what was produced in countries was exported or re-exported, except that doesn't work because of the value added. That fell to a low in 2009 of 52%. So it did fall in that 2-year period by 8 percentage points. And while it has risen, it rose again, it almost reached its 28 level in 2018 to 58%, which is, if you think about value added and stuff, is quite amazing. But then, of course, it's fallen since and is estimated to have been 51.62% last year by the World Bank. These numbers are not exactly comparable, both because of sources and because, as I said, they're certainly not comparable because the value added to GDP is changing so much. But be that as it may, during that same period, US trade went from 10% share of US GDP to 23% in 2020, which is the last year for which I could find the data. So the US share has gone up as a share of trade. And that may be important going forward because as the share of trade goes up, more people will start paying attention to it. It historically has not been as important in the US as it has been in most other countries. And that's one factor that leads me to my second point, which is why President Biden hasn't reversed things. And the first thing to be said is that historically in the United States, trade has never been a major factor that has driven our politics nationally. It has driven them locally because different states have different comparative advantages, you might say. So they're cotton exporting states, and whenever something about cotton comes up, all the southern states that grow cotton will in fact just sort of plow in and so on and so forth. So we have some of that, but it's been, the protectionist sentiment has been greater. Interestingly, right now, President Biden has not, to my sorrow and surprise, reversed any of the Trump policies. But what's interesting is that the Gallup poll, the latest Gallup poll I saw, showed that more than 70% of Americans thought trade was good for the United States. That's almost a high. And what's happening is the public opinion is becoming more supportive of trade. And I'm a little bit optimistic that that will finally get through. In the meantime, what's happening with President Biden, I fear, is that he comes out of the environment in the now so-called Rust Belt states, including Pennsylvania, where he was born, where indeed there was concentration on those industries. Read iron and steel in Western Pennsylvania, read oil, of course, in that part of the country with Rockefeller and all that. Read the manufacturing belt in the Midwest, now called the Rust Belt. And those are what his background is. And as he says proudly, I'm a union man at a time when union membership has fallen in the US to a low of about, last I saw, 8% of GDP, or 8% of the labor force. Not much. And yet that's where he's looking. And at some point, I think somebody will discover that that isn't working and things will change. But in the meantime, we have a protectionist president, I fear. He has renegotiated the iron and steel tariffs for Japan, the UK, and the European Union, but not in a way that takes protection away from US steel companies at all, which are realizing their highest profits historically, but that doesn't seem to change anything. What he's done is he said, okay, you can export to the US the amount that you used to export in the average of 3 years, and I'm not quite sure which they are because their different reports are different, but let's say 2015 to 2017. And with those 3 years, you can export that much with no tariffs. After that, you export any more, you pay the full US tariff, the Trump tariff on the steel import. Now, of course, what that does is transfer the tariff revenue from the US Treasury to the foreign exporters, but it does not allow them to export more without tariffs. So it's still as protectionist as ever and does not much else in terms of changing things. So if you think that that's a sign that Trump tariffs are going to be removed, it doesn't augur well at all. He's dealing bilaterally for the most part and dealing item by item, and unfortunately does not seem to have paid attention to the important issues. So let me just see what can be done. Well, the first, and I'm hurrying because I know I'm running out of time. The first thing that he said is that, as I said, I think there are underlying factors that will finally begin to resonate when the things that the president is advocating are seen not to have worked. I think some of these, as for example, high steel profits will start coming out. The fact that indeed exports, agricultural exports to China did not grow as promised. All of the things that were supposed to be part of the Trump wonderful plan have been destined to be failures. And certainly there will be people, I think, coming forward with that more and more. The second thing is that I think other countries are recognizing the role the US leadership played. And even before the pandemic, as I gave talks in various parts of the world, I sometimes pulled out one, and redid it, of course, but pulled out one I'd started on about 10 years ago, in which I basically said, and I still believe, that one of the problems in the US is that those Americans who are internationalists then hear complaints from people who are very vocal in many other countries saying how terrible the US is and how all these things it does and why they should then have to protect as like the US is doing. But in part, I think the criticism on the US, even though it has been a leader for the multilateral organizations and the multilateral system, has been a factor in leading Americans not to be as pushy on trade as they might be. As I've given talks on trade around the US, I have more often than I like to count, been confronted with the question, well, if trade is so important to these countries, why don't they push for it? And I think there is some truth to the argument that the benefits to other countries have to become made clear more than they have been by those countries themselves, rather than leaving it all to Americans to sort of try and persuade their own protectionists plus the protectionists in the rest of the world. As you see, if that's what we're trying to do, we've lost that battle alone. And I think we need to get more of a coalition and more of a trade coalition across countries as well as within it. The next thing that can be said, of course, is that along with that, we are getting, I think, some recognition of, and I hope we are, in the, what shall I say, the NATO regrouping or the NATO recognition of its importance as a result of the Ukrainian war and things like that. Let us hope that that spills over to an international system that works again. I think we do have problems because there are some defense issues where clearly some degree of national production is warranted. The trouble is that once you say some degree is warranted, everybody producing it will convince you that we should not have a single dollar of imports of anything because they can produce it domestically. And this is a real problem in the US. The anti-dumping laws have been used to do that. The agricultural policy has been used for that purpose. And somehow or they're finding a way to have a carve out for what are truly defense issues and truly issues that affect security and all that, from those where it's the protectionist pressures that are bringing them about. Seems to be, has to be part of the resurrection of the World Trade Organization and of the open multilateral trading system. For lack of time, I'll stop there, except to say once again that Anoop has a lot of insights about a lot of this in his book, and I thoroughly recommend it.
Thank you very much, Anne. You have really so eloquently described the kind of protectionist trends that have been taking place in the United States, perhaps the last 6, 7 years. And from our point of view, or the rest of the world's point of view, this is a real pity because it was the United States that led the world economic order, in a sense, through different multilateral organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and for other countries like ourselves, for those of us who are in favor of more open trade as a feature of getting higher growth, higher productivity, and higher development, that this becomes a problem. That when the leader of, in some sense, the world economic order starts turning protectionist, it becomes more and more difficult to argue the opposite within our own countries. So thank you very much, Anne, for providing that perspective from the United States, which is actually a perfect segue into Martin Wolf's intervention. So Martin, of course, his first qualification is that he's been interested in India for as long as I have known him, which is from sometime in the 1970s. And so he's always, I think, kept track of what happens here, despite the fact that he has to keep track of what's happening all over the world. He is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times London. And I think I would not be exaggerating to say perhaps the most influential economics commentator in the world. And so we're really fortunate to have him. I should mention that he is an honorary fellow of a number of places, including 2 colleges and Oxford University. I don't know how they allow, how one college allows the other to have him as an honorary fellow also, while he's only one honorary fellow in one college. Also in King's College London and the Oxford Institute for Economic Policy. He's also a university professor, honorary professor at the University of Nottingham, University Global Fellow of Columbia University, and various other affiliations. Now, as I said, this is a perfect segue for Martin's intervention. As I understand, he would be talking more about the future and also how the interaction of domestic global politics has destroyed the legitimacy of the global economic integration and the people who promote it in high-income countries. I won't say more than that because that's what I would like to hear what Martin has to say. And of course, I hope that he will also bring in the longer, the more longer-term impact of the current war in Ukraine on, in some sense, the global economic order. Thank you very much, Martin, for accepting invitation. This, of course, I think is your second appearance. And I would say I need to extract a promise from you that when your book does come out, whenever it does come out next year, that you will also consider us for one of your book launches, although I assume you'll do the big one in the UK itself. Martin.
So thank you very much, Rakesh. It's a pleasure to be with you and to participate in this very interesting discussion. I'm going to try and avoid overlapping too much with what Anup and Anne have said, but they have made some very important points. I was particularly interested because I happen to agree with this, that Anup raised questions not just about the future growth of India, but also of China. I think people tend to take too much for granted that China's growth will continue to be exceptionally rapid and that its domestic economic problems are not significant. I think they are actually really quite significant. I also am very interested in what Anne says about trade. Some of what I say overlaps with this a bit, but because I knew she would cover trade in great deal, I'm going to try to avoid overlapping too much. So basically what I want to talk about, or the title I created myself, is Politics versus Economics, Globalization at a Time of International Tension. And I think the really important point I want to make is that over the last 15 years or so, some really big things have happened in the high-income countries. And I'm going to focus on that as my comparative advantage and because of lack of time. And they are now shaping the world in very significant ways, above all, that shaping the way the high-income countries increasingly view the world. And the most important feature of that, in my view, is we are moving towards a definitive adversary politics between the West and China. And that will shape the world. It's not what I wanted, but I think it's where we are. And that will shape the options many countries have. And to me, the Ukraine-Russia war, important in itself, but unless it ends up as a nuclear war, which I still think is pretty unlikely, the most important thing about the Ukraine war is that China has so far and continues to align itself fully with Russia. I think that's really an important decision by China, and it will shape the world. So what I want to say is, under this rubric, I want to make the following points about where we are, and then I'll go to what it might mean for the future. First, of course, to remind ourselves, we have suffered 3 huge shocks in the last 15 years, one of which is going on at the moment, and we don't know how it will last. The first, of course, is the global and Eurozone financial crises, which are really together a North Atlantic financial crisis, affected the high-income countries of the West far more than it affected emerging and developing countries. And the truth is, they never recovered. That growth was remarkably slow after that crisis. Productivity growth in all the major developed countries has been extremely low. And that has created in aging societies immense ongoing structural, fiscal, and social challenges. Second, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course was a global crisis. As Anoop pointed out, the recovery in the West was relatively strong, but it bequeathed a still unresolved legacy of supply shortages and unexpectedly high inflation, or at least unexpected to many. I would have to say that I was one of the ones who was more worried about inflation than most Western commentators, if not quite as bearish as Larry. But it's clear that before we were hit with the Russia-Ukraine war, we had a really big macro problem, which is going to cast a big shadow over the next few years. And we're moving into stagflation, and the Russia-Ukraine war has made this worse because it's created a further supply shocks, notably in energy and food. And one of the consequences of this will be that in many developed countries, in fact, most as far as I can see, real incomes are going to fall for a large part of the population. And that's always politically very, very difficult. So that's the first big point. The second big point is, and I just sort of put it in the background, these shocks came at the end of a pretty long period of rising inequality, low growth of productivity, largely mismanaged deindustrialization from a social point of view, clearly mismanaged financial liberalization, some destabilizing innovations, particularly in the digital sector and particularly in their impact on media. So things weren't really happy in the early 2000s either. And then we got hit by this. In particular, third being point, just to underline what this, over the last 10 years, I would say Trump was a symptom of this. It's now become bipartisan in the US, and Europe in the last couple of years has followed it. There have been growing and deepening mistrust between the US, to a lesser degree, the EU and China, on many, many issues. Its underlying policies, its continued pretense to be a developing country, its theft of intellectual property, its human rights behavior, its geopolitical ambitions, and at the most fundamental level, its desire, perfectly understandable, to be a superpower and recognized as one in its own right, and have a commensurate place in all global affairs. And to put it very bluntly, the US doesn't want this to happen. We can't get around it. It doesn't want this to happen. And of course, China's recent decision to align itself with China has certainly strengthened these attitudes and suspicions big time. I'm not going to go into why China's done this. I can understand it well enough, but it will have consequences. So I think we are in a period of really heavyweight geopolitical tension, and I expect that to last my lifetime and quite probably my children's lifetime. This is a big event. It is a really big event. Now, in that context, then catching the future. What can we do in that context? What is the world going to look like? Well, there's the question which Anne has raised, and I'm just going to go a bit more, look at other aspects of it. I'm not going to go into the trade aspects and the debate on that. As I said, I think we have serious domestic macroeconomic problems, inflation, stagflation, and possible debt problems. this is likely to be a longish period of instability, macro instability. By longish, I don't mean it, I mean it certainly won't be over this year. It will last longer than that, and that will have political consequences. Among them, in my view, is the overwhelming probability that the next president of the United States will be either Donald Trump or someone like him and more competent. And there are plenty of people around who are just like him, but more competent. And I don't think I need to spell out what that means. Their basic policy stance, and called it, I think, protectionism. Protectionism is the least of it. We're talking about nationalism and xenophobia as the core ideology of the contemporary Republican Party, along with tax cuts and deregulation. A fascinating mixture, but that attitude of tax cuts and deregulation doesn't apply across the border. And I think the Democrats are being pulled willy-nilly into a not dissimilar place on trade. So I don't think it's just Biden being from Pennsylvania, though I think it's true. I think there is a wider suspicion in elite politics of engagement, not with trade as such, but of engagement with the most important trading partner, namely China. Now, what does that mean for the future? Well, one thing is, I think we are in a new Cold War. How that's going to develop, it's far too early to tell, but that's my view. And that creates very interesting questions for the future of international economic organizations, which are the proper focus of this panel. I think it's going to be very difficult to reconstruct a genuinely multilateral order. I can't see how the WTO is going to be recreated. I've thought about this quite a lot. I think it'll be very difficult. I think organizations take an issue that I know is interesting, just dealing with debt issues, with emerging market debt issues, involves cooperation between China and Western creditors, which has turned out to be really difficult on the basis of my understanding from my talks with people at the IMF now. So the multilateral organizations and in trade and development are going to be really quite difficult to operate in this world. I expect the emergence of trade policy more on a block basis. And we're already seeing that in Asia with the successor of the TPP and RCEP. So I expect regional blocks to emerge. The EU is increasingly also suspicious of China. Whether there will be a big free trade agreement between the US and EU, I don't know, but it is a perfect possibility. But this is the sort of messy structure I expect to emerge. In the currency world, I discussed this morning in my column, I expect the dollar and the Western currencies to remain hegemonic, but I think China is going to work very, very hard to create a monetary area of its own, by using its own payment system and the digital currency. That's going to create very interesting challenges for developing countries. I can see, I'm going through this and I'm very near the end. In many areas, finance is one, but the digital economy is another. At least we're going to see more than one global regulatory regime. In the digital economy, which I'm following fairly closely, it looks as though there'll be an American regime, a European regime, and a Chinese regime, which will be in very significant ways different in regulating the digital economy. So it really will become very bit by bit. So the general tendency, I suggest, will be towards disintegration of the global system and the emergence of blocks of various kinds. And that will leave huge and complex questions for the countries which are outside these blocks in terms of how they play them off against the other, whether they can be part of more than one. It's going to be quite challenging and complicated and difficult. Now, my very last remark, though I'm rather concerned and depressed about what's happened in this way, and I hope I will be proved wrong, We do, of course, need agreement on certain minimum global needs. We obviously need to deal with the global commons problems. We need to find some sort of framework for maintaining peace to avoid these conflicts getting into hot wars. And Ukraine, Russia is a pretty disturbing precedent here, and everybody knows there are others. And of course, we do need to maintain enough of the open architecture to maintain prosperity. But what I'm basically saying is all this, in my view, has now got very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin, for that incredible tour de force, depressing though it was. But
I might be more cheerful in a few weeks when the war's over.
Yeah, thank you. We all need that.
If it's over.
If it's over, yes. No, this is really turning point, I think, in world, certainly economic history, and as you've outlined, as well as geopolitical history. I think everyone on this panel, maybe even including Naushad, actually, even including him, our generations, I should say, since Naushad is on this call, our generations have really had, in some sense, an absolutely unprecedented period of prosperity and growth in the global economy. And to some extent, we've been spoiled. We've got used to the way things have been. And as Martin outlined, we are entering a new world. And as he said, which is even more frightening, that's what our children will face. So that's depressing. Just a couple more points. One, a point that Anup, you made in terms of the slowing growth in the world. None of you have mentioned one of the, I think, features of slowing growth is the demographics of the world. That every population growth is slowing down everywhere, including India, and including Africa, even though they'll take a little longer to come to the kind of stage that we have got, and we'll take a little longer to the kind of stage China has got. So in some sense, one of the structural reasons for slow economic growth in the next 20 years, certainly, is the slower demographic growth. Another point I just want to make from a personal point of view, Martin, I was delighted that you called it North Atlantic financial crisis, which is the term that I have been using ever since that crisis broke. So I'm delighted that you have noticed that, and I hope it is from me and not from someone else. Having said that, also on the European Union, talking about the multilateral world economic order, that the setting up of institutions in Europe, which can come to the rescue of countries in Europe without going to the IMF, is itself a signal that some of these world organizations will become less effective because people are, the different Chiang Mai, the European system and others are sort of breaking down the multilateral system as we've known it. So having said all that, Naushad, it now remains to you to maybe give us some degree of optimism in talking about inclusive growth and employment, perhaps.
Thanks. Thank you, Rakesh. And Anup, great to be part of your book launch. It's a great pleasure to.
Sorry, Naushad, let me just interrupt for a second to introduce you properly.
Oh, you don't need.
Which I forgot. Sorry about that. Naushad is co-chairman of the Forbes Marshall, which is India's leading process and energy efficiency firm. He is also chairman of Ananta Aspen Center and the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research. He was also the president of the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is a leading Indian chamber of private sector firms in 2016-17. And he's on the board of several educational institutions and public companies. And he was a visiting lecturer and consulting professor at Stanford University for courses on technology in newly industrializing countries. He's written widely on innovation in developing countries and higher education in India. His book, which he has displayed behind him, came out, a month ago or so, maybe a little longer. The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential, published in January 2020, published in January, is also another book that CSEP was the launching pad. So Martin, there's a lot of precedent for you to do that between Anne's book, Naushad's book, Anoop's book. Montek, when he writes his second book, of course, we'll do the same. So Naushad, sorry about that interruption.
Sure. So thank you, Rakesh. Thanks for advertising the book in particular. So it's wonderful to be part of a panel with Anup, with Anne, with Martin, with Montek, and of course with you, Rakesh. My starting point is really Anup's subtitle, which is Rebuilding Growth Potential. And I am going to be somewhat more optimistic about at least India's growth potential. So my argument is that India's growth potential is actually to grow 8 to 10% a year for the next 30 years. That's what we need, and I think that's what we're capable of actually achieving. I'm not in any way saying that that's the trend, or that's a foregone conclusion. But if we carry out all the things that we need to and are capable of doing, then I think that is the potential that we indeed have. All of you know that the story of the last 60 years is a story of a few countries that have been able to grow at rapid rates, at rates of 8 to 10% year on year for 20 to 30 years. A few countries, so Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea in the 60s and 70s, and then, of course, more recently, China since around 1980. And if we grow at 8 to 10% a year for the next, not 30 years, but 20 years, we will then be as big an economy as China is today. In other words, we will add $10 trillion to our current $3 trillion. $10 trillion to the global economy. And that will become an engine for growth, not just of India, but of the world economy more broadly. So the big question is how? And Anup is absolutely right in several of his articles in his book to place productivity at the very heart of growth. That's the essence. I mean, at the end of the day, per capita GDP is a productivity metric, and productivity is at the heart of how one grows per capita GDP in the long run. Anything else is going to be short run. So I think three elements of how we get this consistent long run productivity growth. First is demography. Rakesh, you spoke about demography. India's demography is actually a positive story for at least the next 2 decades or so. For the next 2 decades, India will have a lowering dependency ratio, which in itself is a growth trigger. And we're not the only country in the world, but we're certainly the largest economy in the world that will have an improving demographic ratio and an improving dependency ratio for the next 20 years. Second, there's huge potential in occupational change. When I was in college, one of my professors, Moses Abramovitz, used to talk at great length about occupational change being one of the great drivers of growth as countries first started to develop. People moved from lower productivity occupations into higher productivity occupations. That directly contributed to economic growth. And the archetype is obviously people moving from low productivity agriculture into higher productivity manufacturing. That's a story that's not been an Indian story. The story of India is that we still continue to have far too many people employed in agriculture. 120 million people of our 400 million workforce is still in agriculture. That story of moving people out of low productivity agriculture into higher productivity occupations is still a story, that's still a movie that has to run for India. And that single fact is a potential growth driver for decades for India. Now, what will it take to do that? What we've seen over these last 30 years is people moving out of agriculture and into services. Unfortunately, into relatively informal services. These informal services are more productive in terms of earning power, Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. They've moved to urban areas. They've got employed in small retail operations. They've got employed as security guards. They've got employed as drivers. I mean, not great occupations, but they've earned more than they earn, typically 2-3 times what they earn in agriculture. And that's been one of our major growth driver for these last 30 years. That's a story that still has potential to run in India. If you have most people employed in manufacturing, the potential to then grow productivity still further by a change in occupation is much more limited. If you have most people employed, as we have in India, in agriculture and in informal services, the potential of moving people to more formal services and even to manufacturing, if we get our act together, is still there and is still great. Third, we have great potential also in the quality of human capital and in investing in human capital. Our school outcomes are still very poor in India. If you look at the outcomes of the PISA, the equivalent of the PISA tests that say Pratham runs for India, the results are pretty depressing. And the potential to improve school outcomes and then educational outcomes on a widespread basis, again, is very major and significant for India. So I think for all those reasons, demography moving in India's direction for the next 20 years at least, that we don't have to do anything, it'll just happen, it'll contribute. Second, employment. If we really have an economy that grows as we've seen in these last 30 years, even if we grow at the average of the last 30 years, which is around 6%, that in itself will create employment that will move people into higher productivity occupations with all the consumption growth story that we've seen. And if we can get better quality jobs provided on a widespread basis, then we can grow that much faster. And third, in terms of actual investments in human capital to include many more people in our growth story. Second piece is what's been spoken about already, especially by Anne, in terms of the role of trade and exports. The numbers for India, again, and Anne is absolutely on target with her comment that these percentages are sales to GDP. GDP is a value-added number. Sales is not a value-added number. So you're actually comparing dissimilar things, but it's the metrics that we usually use across countries. India was at 15% trade to GDP in 1990. It rose to 56% in 2012, and at 40, it's about 40% now. At 40%, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that our trade to GDP ratio is still higher than China. China is around 36%, and it's significantly higher than the US, which is, I think, Anne, you mentioned a number of 23%. The number I had was 26%, but somewhere in that range. Sajid Chinoy, who Anne's PhD student 20 years ago, shows that almost the entire slowdown in India's growth rate between the 2000s and the 2010s can be explained by the fall in the share of our exports. Almost the entire slowdown in growth. In other words, if we can actually see India's trade pick up, we can again see that same kind of buoyancy in our growth rates overall. Now, again, how? Well, India accounts at present for about 1.6% of global trade. China, as you all know, accounts for around, I think, 13%. If you want to grow the 13% by 50%, that's tough. That means going from 13% to 20% of global trade. If you want to grow the 1.6% by 50%, that's a pretty modest increase in India's overall share of global trade. So I think we still have great potential, even in the current times, even in the current protectionist environment, for India to actually capture a much larger share of global markets in many countries. And I think the move to diversify away from China can really help India if Indian industry is equipped to actually tap into that opportunity. Now, last point is on the role of technology and the role of in-house R&D. And I'm going to make this point even though Anup doesn't talk about it in his book, but it's definitely part of the story of productivity and sustained productivity growth over time. As many of you have heard, Montek and Rakesh in particular, have heard me say ad nauseum, Indian industry invests too little in in-house R&D. We currently invest 0.3% of GDP in in-house R&D. The global share is 1.5%. That's what China invests as well. So we need to scale our investments in in-house R&D by a factor of 5. This is particularly important for India because Indian industry is more skill and capital intensive than most countries at our level of development. So if we have the skill and capital intensive industrial structure, then the only way in which we can have a vibrant, successful, long-run, successful manufacturing industry is by increasing investment in technology, increasing investment in in-house R&D. We can talk more about that later on, but I'll stop there because it wasn't a topic of Anup's in his book. My last point is a topic that Anup does talk about, which is the size of the state, if you like, and the tax to GDP ratio. And the role of institutions. And he refers in several pieces to the quality of institutions being very important as a way of providing for that sustained growth performance over time. And Anup also mentions that at 17% tax to GDP, we're about 5% short of the 22% that I think the 15th Finance Commission that he was part of had estimated India's tax to GDP potential to actually be. How do you get there? How do you get there? What do you need to do? And I think it's the essential element in tax reform, which is you simplify, you broad base, and you lower. That combination of removing exemptions, of having lower rates with simpler implementation is the way in which you get there. It's what we've seen actually happen over these last 30 years in both corporate and personal income taxes. As rates have come down, the income taxes as a percentage of total tax revenue has gone up. And it's, I think, something that we should keep going back to. That why have we seen the tax buoyancy that we did with the repeated rounds of lowering tax rates over these last 30 years? It's something I think to learn from. But again, lower tax rates together with lower or no exemptions. The same applies to GST, the goods and services tax. The estimate, as you know, is that if we had a 10% rate of GST instead of the current 7 different rates that we have, if we had a 10% rate that applied to about 70% of the economy, so leave out agriculture, it would give you a tax to GDP ratio in itself of 7%, which is about almost twice as much as what we have now. So one could actually have a more modest rate, a much simpler rate, a much more comprehensive coverage with GST, which would also be hugely tax buoyant and would largely close the gap between potential and actual tax to GDP ratios that Anup talks about. A final comment, there's an implication in some of Anup's articles that a higher tax to GDP ratio is somehow good. I'm not sure it is. In a sense, the low tax to GDP ratio also reflects a relatively small state in India. And I think something that Rakesh has pointed out in the past, that the Indian state, contrary to most perceptions, is relatively small. It's particularly small At the local level, it's maybe not as small if you take the foreign service and so on. For a country of our size, our GDP, we're a relatively small state. Given limited state capacity in India, I think actually a small state is a good thing. What we should be looking for, it seems to me, is stronger institutions and stronger independent institutions. And if those stronger independent institutions leads to growth in the state, that's fine. But a stronger direct state in itself, in terms of deeper and more comprehensive government departments, well, I have concerns that is indeed the right way to go. I will stop there, and back to you, Rakesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naushad, for that injection of optimism, certainly as far as India is concerned. So just a couple of comments. The tax GDP ratio, by the way, Naushad, has been rock solid for at least 15 years.
Yeah.
So it's not correct to say there's been great degree of buoyancy. And this is during a time when average growth has been at least 6% in real growth, actually. So clearly there's a huge compliance problem, despite all the tax reforms that have been taken. Yes, it is correct that some of the direct tax ratios have indeed gone up.
Exactly.
Because some of the indirect tax ratios come down, but on the whole, the tax GDP ratio has been absolutely rock solid. And
but income taxes have gone up.
Yeah, but there's no way in which we can finance the sort of education expenditures, health expenditures, which then contribute to productivity. So I leave that as it is. So so Montek, we come to you. I just want to pose a couple of questions just arising from Naushad, which is that even if the India does all the correct economic policies from what we think are correct or what you might think are correct, but in the context of a global slowdown, both in GDP as well as in trade, is it feasible to achieve the kind of growth rates that Naushad mentioned? And second, something not correct in Naushad or even Anup's book, since you've been working on this issue for some time, is the prospects of policy changes in the world to do with climate change got more muddied with the kind of future of the global world or economic order that Martin talked about? But you're obviously free to talk whatever you want. Now you need to unmute yourself, Montek.
Thank you. Thanks, Rakesh. Thanks for asking me to join in. Obviously, a great pleasure to be on a panel with all my friends, and in fact, discussing a book which I had told you and told Anup I really greatly enjoyed reading. Now, you know, the trouble with a book that stimulates thinking is that the debate then gets much wider. So, as a matter of fact, the various panelists have, I think, covered a terrific amount of ground, all very relevant. It's kind of getting further and further away from Anup's book. That doesn't matter. Let me just make a few comments, which just partly respond in a way to what you're saying. You know, I feel that in the debate in India, we are in this funny situation where there's a huge amount of agreement on the slogans and very little agreement on the policies. I mean, at various lectures that I've been giving, I've been trying to explain to people that if you want to characterize a strategy, you could characterize it as consisting of 4 different things. Slogans, which are actually very important. I mean, they shouldn't be thought to be unimportant because they capture the imagination. Targets, which are very specific. We can measure whether you're getting there. And then the instrumentalities, which are either programs or policies. And it's really in the last of these, which is policies, where the standard of debate at the moment is hopelessly deficient. So let me just focus just on that specifically. I mean, the program side is important because whether it's climate change, or for that matter, the changing geopolitical situation, which creates a security problem for India, the need to improve human capital, all of this is going to require a lot more money from the government. So Anup talks about, you know, the importance of having the fiscal balance. Everybody agrees with that as a slogan. Everybody also agrees that the state has to play a bigger role, hopefully in areas other than what the state left to itself typically does. But in these areas, even you can spend money and get nowhere. But let's say everyone agrees we should do that. But how are we going to finance all that? And I mean, Anoop's book poses that problem, and somehow we've got to solve it. You've discussed the whole issue of taxation. The other thing is really on trade policy. I mean, Anne raised all the right issues, and I mean, in India, I mean, they were always relevant. I mean, she was part of the original debates in India trying to educate the Indian public, as indeed was Martin Wolf. That look, this is a neglected area. I mean, we never listened to our own trade economists. I mean, Jagdish Bhagwati and V.K. Ramaswamy and all these people. The good thing about 1991 was, for once, we seemed to be, as it were, joining the consensus. What I feel a bit unfortunate is that the way the world has moved, globally, it's very easy for critics of the open policy to say, aren't you peddling something which is dead in its countries of origin? And that's the whole debate. I mean, it's overdone. Yes, there's protectionism, shouldn't have been there. But I mean, the real question, and I tend to agree with Martin that, regrettable though it may be, at least in the near future, we are going to have a world that's fractured into different blocks, with, if you like, the authoritarian bloc with China, the US and EU being the next ones. I mean, China would be quite happy to be fully integrated with the other two blocs if the blocs don't kind of feel that, look, their policies are not consistent with remaining open. Unfortunately, they do feel that, so you are going to have a remaining open. Unfortunately, they do feel that, so you are going to have a fracture. What should India do? Too often I find that the formula that is put forward is that we must work for a multilateral trading system with multilateral rules. That is certainly true if there was a reasonable chance that anyone wants it. I think for one reason or another in the near future, that's unlikely. So this poses a question: can we achieve all the wonderful things that Naushad is hoping for without aligning with at least one or two of these blocks? I mean, I'm assuming that we're not going to be aligning with the authoritarian China-led bloc. But that raises some real questions. Is there any bloc that we are willing to join? In a recent discussion, I posed the issue that, the US, unfortunately, has walked out of the TPP. And given domestic politics in the US, it's very unlikely that they will join. But on the other hand, Japan is pushing the same thing. And it's quite possible that 2 or 3 years down the road, the US attitudes might change and they may want to join. Personally, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to join that group. Now, I was in favor of us joining the RCEP group also, but the presence of China scared Indian industry massively. And it's very difficult when the world is getting afraid of dealing with China because of lack of confidence in the transparency of the Chinese system. It's very difficult to argue, no, don't worry, we can take care of it. But there's no China in the other one. What there is in the other one is much deeper integration, i.e., what is called behind the border measures. Now, traditionally, we have taken the view that trade policy should have nothing to do with behind the border measures. It should just be dealing with border measures. If you want to integrate the way the world is going, it's unlikely that you're going to achieve it without getting into behind the border measures. I think somebody in India needs to pose this. It's perfect. I would accept a person's proposition if they were to say, because we don't agree about behind the border measures, we should not be in any bloc. I mean, the moment somebody says that, people would begin to think, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, we can negotiate what these behind the border measures are. We can have stretched out timings for compliance, all that sort of thing. But I think we need to do something like that. In the absence of that, I think what will happen, everybody will agree with Naushad's view that India can grow at 8%. You know, technology, education, this, that, and the other. But I think far too many people will say that the way to grow at 8% is to protect Indian industry by raising tariffs. And that debate, I thought, was actually dead, in the sense I didn't think that anyone would credibly make that argument. Unfortunately, and I think Naushad agrees with this because he's the one outspoken, commendably so, Indian industrial distinguished person who speaks against this proposition, but the vast majority of industry are not willing to speak up. That look, if you raise tariffs, you're actually making us uncompetitive. The vast majority of industry spokespersons do not believe that a tariff is a tax on exports. At the same time, we're talking about joining global value chains. Now, it would be perfectly all right, not perfectly all right, but it would be understandable if the view was that, look, we want to go for self-reliance and isolation, but that is not the government's target. And the government, give it the benefit of the doubt, they have repeatedly said that Atmanirbhar is strengthening the economy. It is not isolation. We want to be integrated in global supply chains. And unlike in the past, they're not saying this has to be done by Indian technology, nor by Indian enterprise. I mean, they're actually saying, look, FDI is welcome. So those are positive things. But the question really is that if the rest of the world is integrating in a series of blocks, and we remain isolated from those blocks with our own high tariffs, waiting for a multilateral negotiation before we lower them, is there any chance on earth of us kind of actually integrating with any global supply chain? And my answer would be 100% no. But I don't think this has been adequately discussed. It's not being posed to the government. It's not being discussed in the academic world in India. And sadly, it's not on the agenda of the internal industry discussions either. So frankly, I mean, when Anup says that, you know, if you like, the one sentence summary of Anup's book that I got, and was very nicely done, is that, look, you've got to be concerned about your fiscal balance, and you better remain open. I mean, you really can't fail on either of those fronts. But if you, and I think at a slogan level, people will go along. But when you translate that into policy, there are too many bad policies that will come up in order to achieve those objectives. I mean, I agree with Naushad on the tax side. But you know, the most common thing one hears now is that if President Biden says we want to tax the rich, isn't this the time for us to do it in India also? Because along with the global concern about inequality, we've got, I don't know what the basis of these numbers is, but we've got a huge amount of articles being written that within country inequality in India has become really bad. It's quite possible. I just haven't seen the data carefully enough. But you know, even on taxation,
I think we lost you, Montek. Can others hear me?
I can hear you, Rakesh.
in the consumption
Montek,
basket.
you're back. Yeah, you were just somehow, we lost you for a minute.
Okay. So what do you want me to do?
Well, we need to conclude also, actually.
Okay, well, let me assume that out of what I've said, the basic thrust of my argument will be reasonably clear.
Yes.
So let me thank you for asking me to speak.
So it was loud and clear, actually. And if I can just push Naushad further, that since a big part of this discussion has been openness, and which he also advocates, Montek just talked about it, and of course talked about it, Martin to a certain extent, that the one issue on which we have not been able to work is trade. So it's all in your hands, Naushad, for us to be able to work in trade, as we discussed yesterday, because it's really important for the country. Okay, so we now only have, unfortunately, 10 minutes. And I'll just read out some of the important questions that have come. And if I may leave it to, if each of you can take one question of those, so, and then you just choose whichever one you want. So first one, how should India react to the calls for refocusing development banks away from country lending to the financing of global public goods? That's from Suman Berry, my successor at NCAR. And my last successor at NCAR, that Shekhar Shah, has also put a question that would you agree that emerging markets face a number of challenges that have come together? US monetary policy, Russia and the start of the Cold War, China slowing growth, and global technological change that will keep replacing workers. So that's the second one. Third, this is actually addressed to Martin. How do you view antagonistic India and China coming in support of Russian position? Does that imply the reliability of US is low in India and to some extent Pakistan as well? Is pivot to Asia in trouble? Final question that if I can choose from here, let's see. I think that's about, yeah, I think that's, one more. How can increasing share of trade address increasing inequality? This is actually addressed to Anne. That's 4 questions. So there are 4 of you, not including Montek. So choose.
Well, I can go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, share trade and inequality.
Yeah.
I think the appropriate response is that inequality needs to be addressed through instruments that address it, such as progressive income tax, social safety net, and so on. The argument that trade is responsible for inequality doesn't really hold up to very close inspection. In the US, the numbers that I've seen suggest that probably something between 70 and 90% of the increase in inequality is associated with the shift in share toward capital, which in turn comes about because of innovation and technical change. So that even within the wage structure, it's the people who are more skilled who are getting better trade. But that's what we want anyway in the world as a whole, is to get people higher productivity, as Anoop's book shows. And the way to do that is, of course, to get the economy functioning well, then have a system of taxation and social safety net issues that address the fundamentals that basically can take care of that, but do it through a system that's neutral with regard to what you're producing, so that your production structure and your trade structure reflects what you could do, in fact, to get the productivity up. The idea that you could cut down trade, and I think generally shows that that has not worked to reduce inequality. I think quite the contrary. It has shown that when you cut back on trade, you get more protected interests within the country, which in turn mean that you get more monopoly rent, small scale or big scale, and you would indeed protect people from the competition that helps you get a more even level playing field. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. Martin?
These are such complicated
Yes.
question. I think in a way the anonymous question about India and China and support for Russia and relationship with the West and how they view them, it gets to the broader question, which I think Montek has raised, and which I just don't think I can deal with in a minute or two. But I'm assuming that India has to pursue its own interests, obviously, which are for security and also for prosperity. And in the world I've described, this is going to be very complicated. And I think it's very, very difficult to make blanket statements. In general, I would be pro-trade. In general, I would be pro being part of any block or arrangement which looks to increase your opportunities. And in general, I would take the view that you want to avoid getting on the wrong side of either of the relevant superpowers, and which means being in the middle in various complicated ways. It's complicated geometry, using the US for security and perhaps at the same time using China for trade and opportunity, but it's really complicated. And I'll give you just one example, which I touched on, which is digital stuff. Do you want Chinese or maybe even American high-tech digital companies, Alibaba and so forth, to play a central role inside your economy? They have a lot of very good technology. They're also going to pass all the data they have to the Chinese state. We know they are. So I would just say that the general thrust of where you want to go is pretty clear, and you want to stay out of this mess at the same time, and you want to protect your own autonomy and security, and it's going to be complicated. And the key point I get from Montag is you've got to think this through properly. But reflex protectionism is a very silly policy, but the world unfortunately has got more complicated than I would like it, and it's not a world I like, but it's the reality.
Thank you very much, Martin. Anup?
Just one very quick point. Many of these questions and issues relate to India. And if you look away from the next 2 months or 1 year to the next 20 years, India has to be a very important factor in that, partly for reasons that Martin said about advanced countries and growth, what we know about China. So India is going to be a critical factor for the world in the next 20 years. Having said that, going back to Naushad pointed to countries in the last 40 years that have grown at 8 to 10%. And we hope India is next. I certainly do. My only problem is that, as Naushad pointed out, 2 factors were critical for these countries. For China in particular, but also others, human capital and the use of demographics. Number 2, in all cases, trade. A smaller number 3, as he said in recent years, is R&D expenditure. My problem is, in all 3, India seems to be moving away, not towards being the largest growing country in the next 20 years. That's all.
Thank you, Anup. So, Naushad, you have the last word apart from my last word.
I think Anup should have the last word, actually.
That was mine.
Sorry. So, you don't think? Okay. Well, I'll just add a quick comment to what Anup just said. I mean, I agree with him entirely. I think India should be a big part of the story for the world going forward. It has the potential to be. And I agree with Anup entirely that those 3 pieces need to come right for India to play this big part in the story. On the trade front, I think there are some encouraging signs. I think we saw rising protectionism from 2017 to about 2021 that went together with a kind of anti-FTA perspective. That's changed in the last year. We're starting now to see some FTAs being seen as positive again. We've signed an FTA with the UAE. There's one with Australia that's imminent. There's discussion underway with the UK, and there's discussion underway with the EU. If those move as they should, they potentially will be quite valuable and powerful, and it will actually align India more in the right kind of block, if you like, the point that Montek asked us to think about. The one thing that we do need to worry about very much is investment in human capital, and I think it's the new education policy points in the right direction. We have to see it get implemented.
Thank you very much, Naushad. Let me just make a couple of comments on the FTAs. We need to remember our geography, where we are located.
Yeah.
So doing FTAs with the UK, the EU, basically countries or regions that are going to go very, very slowly in the next 30 years, the next 20 years. UAE doesn't matter. So I think that was sort of a bit of a false hope. I guess it's just your optimism that brings out even false hopes. And the key issue really is, despite the issue of China, that our geography is in Asia. And to walk away from the RCEP or RCEP or not doing anything with the Trans-Pacific what's it called, TTP or TPP?
CPTPP.
CPTP. I mean, that's where a future, that's the part of the economic world that's going to grow. And so if you want to grow at 8-10%, you can't be locked up with countries not going to grow. So Naushad, I think here I really do disagree with you very strongly.
No, you're right. You're right. Our future rests in Asia. I'm just saying
that's a geography. You can't escape. You can't.
Absolutely right.
To Europe.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So having said one bit worth in a sense on the last comment, I'm glad you gave me that opportunity. There is one other question that Suman Berry had raised that I think I'll try and attempt to answer, which is what is the implication of multilaterals moving to financing global public goods rather than countries? My answer there is that's fine, because for most, at least for larger countries, except perhaps for African countries, the multilateral is not important for financing development. Yes, the IMF remains important when there's a crisis, no question. But the share of multilaterals in larger, emerging markets is negligible, actually. It doesn't matter. And if climate change, other global public goods is something they can help with, well and good. And of course, that help each country as well. Now that all it remains for me is to now really thank first my staff, that is Trisha, Kevin James, and Malvika Sharad, who were all the behind the scenes people who've arranged this webinar. Thank you very much for all your hard work. I know that you are very hard work these days, because we have another webinar coming up on climate change on April 4th, if I'm not mistaken, or April 6th, I think. Sorry, I think it's April 6th. So watch the space. But finally, to really thank Anup for writing his book. I was skeptical when I saw that he was just putting his articles together, but I was pleasantly surprised that in fact it's gripping reading. So I do recommend it. And as Montic has also said the same thing. Martin, for really taking time out, what must be a very busy time for you, situated where you are. Again, geography matters in terms of what's going on in the world. Really appreciate very much your presence. And of course, even though it was brief, giving us a real tour de force on what's happening in the world and what we might expect, even though it was depressing. And Anne, thank you so much, despite your activities yesterday, that you consented to join us in your early morning. So thank you, and hope we will continue our association with CSEP and of course personal otherwise anyway. And Naushad, delighted that you're still keeping up your industry voice, even though it doesn't gel with other industry voices. But I hope that you can have more of an impact on your colleagues in industry to change their views towards a more growth-oriented view. So thank you very much, Naushad, to be with us. And again, I should announce that he is the latest benefactor of CSEP as of this morning. So thank you very much, Naushad. And we are going to put our mouth where our words are, which is, work on trade and competitiveness. But we have to get a little more help in that to do it. So thank you all very much. And I'm only 4 minutes over time. So that's a real achievement on my part. Thank you all. And thank you once again, Anup.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye and thanks. And I didn't talk about the book, but I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
So let me just end by showing his book again.
Yeah, we can show them.